Yo, what is up? Wow. In the last month, or last few weeks, gotten 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 new patrons. Thank you so much. Shout out to Jen Grant, Jason, Daryl Jens, Edgar Moreno, Philosophical Minds podcast. Check them out. Sky, Elijah N, Juan Velasquez. Welcome to the Juan on Juan podcast. Joy Rider. Shout out to Joey. He's a real OG. And shout out to Peter Shell. Peter Shell is another OG. Thank you so much for the generous donations, tips, and thank you for signing up for the Patreon. Patrons get exclusive content, early access, stickers, perks, direct access to me if you want to send me a message, talk to me, whatever. And thank you to all those who have bought a comic book or a Cultus Mundi. Really appreciate it. It's because of you guys that it helps. It really helps with the show because, I mean, we do have, like I said before, we do have expenses. And as much as I love doing it for free, which, I mean, I'm still going to continue to do it regardless. But every little bit helps to keep the lights on and keep this operation going. So thank you so much, everyone who signed up for the Patreon. And make sure to check it out, patreon.com/the101 podcast. You can find the rest of the stuff on my Ko-Fi or on my website, YouTube, 101 podcast. Love you guys. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy the show.
To the Juan on Juan podcast with your host, Juan Ayala.
Welcome back to another episode of the Juan on Juan podcast. I'm your host as always. And today as a co-host joining me is everybody's Romie, Roman from Rising from the Ashes podcast. And I've been very excited for this episode because I just finished the book and it blew me away. I couldn't put it down. The Architect as magician. And yes, we're going to go there. And today we have Dr. Albert C. Smith with us. What's going on, Albert? How you doing today?
Good. I'm really happy to come on this podcast. I think you're hitting some very interesting things here. And of course, it's a subject area that I've gotten fascinated in, along with a lot of other ones. But so I'm really looking forward to our talk.
Absolutely. And for those, this is your first time ever on a podcast. Is that correct?
Well, I've been teaching online since of COVID for the last year and a half, and they're all sort of like big podcasts. So we'll see if this goes the same way.
Awesome. And like I said, I couldn't put the book down. For those that want to check it out, The Architect as Magician. And I know you co-wrote this with your wife that has unfortunately passed away. And you have a lot of interesting things, and my condolences, by the way. And you have a lot of interesting things in here that I don't know how the community reviewed this, because I haven't looked at the reviews, but did you get any pushback or anything at all when it comes to this? Because you define magic and architecture, and pretty much as the title states, the architect as magician, where the process of building a building is a magical process. Did you get any pushback when you were talking about this sort of stuff? Like, what was that like?
I'm not getting pushback academically. In fact, I think it's going over rather well. When you write an academic book, you're not going for the money. You're going for, the publication. It's a good publisher, and I'm very happy with them. My advisor used to say you'd make enough money off your book to get a good dinner.
It always seems that precious information really goes overlooked at times, and it's how people have told me before, oh, what does it matter? What do you mean, what does it matter? How you were talking about the Renaissance. This is at the core of everything that we know today to be how it is. And what got you into this sort of topic? Because I know you are an architect. What got you writing about this in specific, and what got you into the field as a whole?
I'm very interested in communications. I got into education a few years ago and decided that one of the things I wanted to do was go on for my advanced degree PhD. I did it in representation, which is an area about how we communicate, what buildings mean. And so this is a subject that, you sort of channel into fairly quickly if you're moving in that area.
And the representation of what buildings mean, right? Because a lot of people, we live in these homes, we coexist with architecture, but there's always this missing link. And the one that I can think of, that an example that people are going to be familiar with, is the pyramids of Giza, right? The Egyptians, how were they able to build something? But not only how were they able to build it, but why they built such a thing. For what was the purpose? You know what I mean? Do you have any ideas of what they were built for, or could have been built for?
Well, why don't I start off with a little bit of the broad base of what this is about. Then we can go directly into that. I think that humans create architecture as a means to control nature. Certainly the Egyptians did that. And once a building could keep the rain off and the wolves out, architecture evolved as its creators became interested in keeping the ghosts at bay and establishing a connection to the heavens. I believe to clearly define and represent the heavens. I believe that to do this and represent the ghosts and other unknown things affect on how we as humans inhabit this world, and remains a large part of our search for meaning. Few would disagree that an architect is a critical element that which we engage and represent this search. Historically, architecture has been used to represent mankind's place in the cosmos, and architects use various means to engage this search through the building process. From the scientific all the way to the religious. Yet other areas of thought have affected the design process. And for example, the search for meaning in architecture can also point to past relationship between the conception of architecture and its means of production. The process of architectural design is analogous to the traditional concepts, and we can take that process and connect it to magic. Now, the pyramids, I think maybe we go back to Saqqara's pyramids, which are actually earlier, designed by Imhotep. Imhotep was the first named architect we know. Very interesting guy. Imhotep was a head scribe for Pharaoh, an educated guy. He was a physician. He was said to be the inventor of hieroglyphics, writing. He was his architect and designed those first pyramids. And he's also a magician. A lot of people don't realize that. And I think they're all interconnected. If you look at the Egyptian philosophy of the world, everything was magical. And so the afterlife became incredibly important. So for the pharaoh, building the pyramids became not only sort of a philosophical thing to sort of explain and prepare for the afterlife. Some people think they were make-work projects when the Nile rose and nobody had any work, so people could come and work on the pyramids and get paid by the pharaoh and live. They're fascinating places, of course. Pharaoh was buried with all sorts of little effigies. You find architectural models in tombs. You see models of bakeries, breweries, cattle shops, etc. And you go, why? And the idea was that Pharaoh in the afterlife, of course, being a magical sort of guy, could clap his hands together and those would become real. In a way, our use of architectural models are still like that. They're still imbibed with a certain amount of magic. I know that the slaves of Pharaoh must have been very happy because they must have done a lot of talking to Pharaoh. Wouldn't it be better to be buried with little tiny effigies of slaves, little clay ones, and they would put them in giant pots? And so in the afterlife, Pharaoh could clap his hands and say, his slaves do this, slaves do that. Much better than burying them all with the Pharaoh, which I didn't think probably ended up as a very popular idea. Symbolically, the building really starts to explain, what the afterlife was. If you look at the pyramid, it goes up into infinity. So it's really talking about infinity.
Into the monad, right? You can say that the tip is the monad?
Yeah, well, it's also, they started off at Saqqara in layers, like the ziggurats. They were sort of borrowing from each other. So they were always taking it. And then I think as you go to Giza, it all starts into that smooth, perfect form. They got better at it.
It's an imitation of a mountain, though, because mountains were associated with higher powers and the gods.
They were magic mountains. Also, if you look at ziggurats, they were sort of moving away from the earth to the heavens.
Yeah, it's like the Tower of Babel type of story where they're trying to construct something in order to get to the gods. And if you look at how high they were, 13 acres, because I'm planning a trip to Egypt here come early next year, and it's 13 acres that the Great Pyramid takes up, which is huge. And this idea that you're talking about where the Egyptians took everything very literally and Imhotep being the one that invented hieroglyphics. Well, hieroglyphics were just that. It was an interpretation of a real world to them. If they were to draw a donkey with two bags the donkey in real life had to have the two bags. They couldn't overburden him in this Plato's world of forms, right? That's where essentially they paved the way for Neoplatonic thought, which Marsilio Ficino is one of my favorites when it comes to this whole topic. But this idea of burying little models, and I know your expertise is actually modeling.
Well, it's one of them. Yeah.
Well, one of them. But
one of the many.
Yeah, one of the many. This idea of burying the pharaoh with little effigies and little models, I think of the terracotta soldiers when it was a micro of the macro. The king or the emperor wanted to build a little micro kingdom of the kingdom he was going to have in the celestial upper eons, I guess you could call it. That's what they were all about.
They were, and each one of those little soldiers, terracotta soldiers, is different.
That's scary.
Each one is modeled after a real person, who I'm sure was quite happy they were being buried themselves.
Well, I have an idea with that, Dr. Smith, because the Hans purple, it escapes this reality when it's taken to a certain temperature. And I think that they were able to somehow alchemically infuse their soul into this terracotta soldier, and they would be there for eternity. Because the color Hans purple they cannot reproduce it. With technology, it is not producible again. And scientists have tried to crack the code and they haven't been able to. But when you take it to a certain temperature, it escapes this dimension quite literally. It escapes the visible light spectrum. So who knows what they were up to? Because I know you talk about alchemy a little bit in the book, but we know that they were up to some next level magical ideas, I guess you could call it. I don't know how else to put it.
Well, you hit on an interesting point with the pictogram, the writing, and as he invites writing, he's really making a representation of the world. And you're exactly right. The Chinese did this too. A representation of a tree or a human or whatever looks like a human. And he had the stylus, and you usually see the stylus, and I would argue that stylus is the same thing that he designs with. Design actually means to make a mark, if you look at the etymology of the word. And if you look at that pencil, it's almost like a magic wand.
Yeah, because I like that. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You get that again and again. Gosh, kid, you draw so well. You're almost magically talented, and people bring that up again and again.
I like the story that you bring up in the first chapter of speaking of having otherworldly powers. That's how these individuals were looked at in ancient times, where they were able to. It's theurgy, right? It's able to magia naturalis, where they're able to manipulate nature to their will. So they were looked at as magicians, these architects. And I like the story that you talk about in the book of the cave paintings, where the community, not after the architecture becomes a home and it provides you with security and all these things, and you build a community around that, the magician, the architect as well, would draw these pictures, but they would serve as talismans. Did I get that correct? Where they would want to evoke, either it was a buffalo, it would evoke a buffalo, or did I get that right?
Well, it could be an icon, but yeah, they would try and make images, and they would have image magic from that. The idea that, and you see this in cave painting after cave painting. Maybe you're living in a place where the herds have gone away, so they wanted to make images of it in hopes that the herds would come back. Now, the interesting thing about such people, and that the way they control people, is they could see, they could understand nature, and they were usually some of the more educated people. And Hoptep was basically a Renaissance person. He's a good model for later. Some people argue that Hoptep was Joseph from the Bible. And certainly they wanted to get up close to the powers to be, and Pharaoh was it. Pharaoh had the money, and Pharaoh had the ability to build. And so getting close and being able to advise thoughtfully, being an educated person, you could start to deal with all those issues of controlling nature.
Can I ask you?
Created the irrigation system too in Egypt. But go ahead.
I was going to ask you about mnemonics. Mnemonics built into used as in the way to harness memory and maybe even celestial memory, and how the architecture may have been used in sacred geometry to be used as a mnemonic device. And that word is hard because it has that extra M in the beginning, so it's hard for me. It's MNEMONIC.
I think you're talking about memory as a whole, and memory is very important. In fact, if you look at monuments, the roots of the word monument comes from memory. We're trying to create memory of an event, a person, an idea, to present it. So it's an incredibly important part of architecture. Actually, I was critting a student today, and we ended up talking about memory quite a bit, because he's working on Alzheimer's and how do you create spaces for people that are losing their memory. It's fascinating.
Wow.
Yeah.
So true. How do you honestly? I'm curious. What is, if you can share what he's working on, or what's your recommendation?
I think
on setting up maybe your own home.
He has to sort of take the bodily senses and enhance them. And, what are some of the most powerful things that are part of our memories, such as smell, for example, for a person, and so you can identify where you are and how you lived.
The way I came across this information, actually, it was while doing research for an episode that I was doing with Roman on his show, and it was about mirrored realities, about mirrors and magic. And I came across an article that by a Japanese gentleman, Taikuchi Dai, and I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he writes a lot about magic and the occult. And he had this thing about the Mundus Imaginalis and John Dee and Edward Kelly on how phenomenology, and I always get it wrong, but this idea that what you experience is true to you. So how you're saying, how do you lay out a building or a room or something in order to cater to somebody who's having issues with their memory? What phenomenon can you trigger within them that'll be able to connect those missing, I don't know what, neurons or something in their brain to be able to remember? How you're saying Vitruvius talked about the different spaces and that they evoke different feelings, because architecture, and I think a lot of people are missing this concept, that it's meant to invoke a feeling within you. Mm-hmm. It's not just there for you. We take advantage of it, right? Where we're just going in and we don't realize that the way that light comes into a building.
Shelter.
Yeah, it's just a shelter. I just live here. It looks nice, whatever. I cut the grass every weekend, et cetera, et cetera. But they forget that at the core roots of architecture, it is magical. It's meant to invoke a certain type of feeling with the layout. And this room is meant for this other room is meant for that. And Vitruvius, if you mix them, you get some sort of weird result. What are your thoughts on that, of that architecture is meant to invoke a feeling and an experience? You're meant to experience these buildings.
Well, I think it's centered to what we do. And one of the reasons we got off of that, we disenchanted ourselves by sort of removing the magical side. And this was a sort of a modernist way of we looked at it, technological, scientific. So people said, my goodness, we really can't be talking about magic when we're doing science. Though people like the roots of science that are coming from magic. In fact, most of the professions have a very strong link to magic. So it's just not architecture. I think you can look at, law and medicine, etc. But by removing that section of almost the spiritual, the soul, from the equation, we start getting soulless buildings, and there's can be a problem.
Would you consider brutalist architecture to be a part of that compartment?
It gets a little interesting because the smart architects never really sort of cut it all out, like Le Corbusier. He was always very interested in magic and sort of
Alchemy.
entwined in this building.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Le Corbusier was named Pierre Jeanneret, and he took the name of the Crow because it was a magical being. I don't know if you know that. And
He did what? I'm sorry, Albert. Can you repeat that again?
Well, Le Corbusier and was certainly one of the more famous architects of the 20th century. But he was a Swiss architect, and that's not his name. He took it as a nickname, and means the crow, and he took it because the crow was a magical being.
Mm-hmm. And alchemical as well, part of the alchemical processes of putrefaction.
Well, he's an interesting guy. I mean, he'd been off in Russia. He'd certainly been working and knew the constructivists. The constructivists were into an interesting period where they couldn't really go back to the church, and the spiritual side of the Russian constructivists, kind of the Russian, they couldn't talk about it because the communists were ticked off of the church. So they started to bring in new and different ways. Yeah, you can take a look at all the forms of the hat of a nun, and the way the light goes through. He's using every trick in the book. So he certainly knew what the constructivists were doing, and they were replacing the church with alchemical symbols, etc.
Yeah, and how Falconelli says that cathedrals were alchemical texts in pictures in order to inform,
hieroglyphs,
right?
Kind of.
Yeah, like a hieroglyphs, and only the initiated would understand what they were looking at, because it goes back to that. And the book that really set it off for me, that piqued my interest and made me reach out to you, was the book Pythagorean Palaces by Hersey. And I was reading that, and just this idea of Pythagoras, because I'm very intrigued by Pythagoras, the idea that they're able to elevate, right? Because that's why there's elevations in architecture, to elevate the state of consciousness within these buildings, right? Marsilio talked about, Ficino talked about it, I love anything really interdimensional. So the idea of getting another dimension within a physical shell, that just blew my mind. Where they were thinking about, if you adhere to these principles and you follow this formula, this magic, you're gonna make something within this building that is above this level of consciousness. That blew my mind.
Well, one thing that it develops is, a cathedral, for example, certainly takes ritual. How you enter the church, how you go down the aisle, how the mass proceeds, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the same things that really are part of magic, which is part of a ritual. Now, cathedrals are certainly built for an illiterate population to try and explain the liturgy of the church. But there are all sorts of little side trips on there, stained glass windows, and we're telling stories. The statues are telling stories, everything in that building. So a monk could come by and just grab some illiterate population and just talk about this.
Mm-hmm.
If you go to Chartres Cathedral, I remember there used to be a historian from England who would go there every summer and spend his summers there, just give lectures off one of the windows. So, 10 o'clock, everybody gets together, everybody gives him a couple of bucks, and he lectures about this one window. And just the images are explaining the entire thing. And then you come back an hour, he'll talk about another, and then another, and another. And, you could just keep paying this guy for weeks, and he's talking about it.
Funny enough, the last time I was in a cathedral was in San Francisco, and I was pretty into architecture at this point, so I was really excited to see it. I was kind of let down, as it's when you look at like the real Gothic cathedrals and the cathedrals of true antiquity compared to the cathedrals that are thrown up as like mock-ups here in America, you're kind of let down. It's not as spectacular. But when we did set in for a session, and they were doing just that. The church was going through each window. They had all the lights off, and they would highlight just this one window, and he would tell a story, and there would be music behind it, and it was incredibly theatrical. And then they would move to each window and just have that story go through. And I was like, man, I just popped in on the right Sunday, or do they do this every Sunday? Is
Well,
this,
even the original cathedrals were like big shows. They, would have huge incense going through. One of the things I found was they would have wires up at the top, and they would get automata that would fly down the wires, and like an angel with its wings flapping.
I did not know that.
Well, the best ones, they had there's a famous one of the devil would slide down.
Oh,
It's scaring the hell out of the entire congregation. I'm sure to get a little more money out of them, but it must have been quite a show going on in these places.
oh, yeah, and that night is when all the alchemists would come in, because a lot of the cathedrals underneath would have would surely have tombs underneath for old Isis worship.
Oh, there's
and
the
then
devil's head. Yep.
Oh, whoa, there you go.
Yeah.
I had
Yeah, big into
Flying through the
puppetry in
air.
the past.
Yeah.
I had no idea about this until I read your book, that they had how the story of John Dee and the Beetle for the play that he would do. Obviously, that was the 1500s. I don't know what year this would be. Yeah, 60.
He
Yeah.
was the advisor to Queen Elizabeth.
Yes. And he would allegedly he made an automata of a huge scarab beetle for some play. I think it was Zeus or something, where it would descend up the stage, and they associate him with with being a sorcerer because people didn't understand this automata. They couldn't understand, like, wait a minute, this is a machine. This is something that you made. Like, you got to be in bed with the devil if you're being able to come up with stuff like this. So imagine somebody seeing this creepy ass thing. Look at that thing, bro.
Well, the Prague astronomical clock that has a lot of mysterious lore behind it. They have a whole puppet show in there too, like that, like goes, I think, every time the clock dings off or something. And just thinking about being at these, living in the past like this, when things would just animate out of buildings. We don't do that anymore at all. Even the TV, it's like, okay, cool, it's an image on a screen, and it's fine and dandy, but it's not a puppet popping out of a building.
Well, it's fascinating that people are starting to get into AI right now. And in a way, it's the same thing. It's trying to create life. So they were fascinating with this back then. Leonardo da Vinci is said to have made an automaton lion. There's always a story of
Descartes too, with his
Francine.
Yeah, Francine. I didn't know that about. I studied Descartes. I didn't even know about that. That he made a replica of this little girl who was the daughter of a servant, right? Did I get that right?
That's right.
Yeah, I didn't know about that until I started reading into this. I'm like, holy crap! And then the idea of essentially how you're saying it all goes back to man trying to mimic divinity, trying to become a god, trying to become a demiurge, as Ficino puts it, where these architects are the demiurges and these buildings are their homunculus, essentially. Because I love the way that they put in Pythagorean Palaces, where this idea of having ideas transcend different levels of reality. So when an architect thinks of it, that's the fetus in his mind. And when he brings it forth, it's the baby, the model, the drawing, right? Verbal expression, it's the baby. And the actual...
Filaretti writes about that. Yeah.
Who else?
Filaretti,
Filaret.
the Renaissance of the period. He talks about giving birth to your idea. So
Yes.
I think this is a fairly common idea. Francine, of course, it talks about that sort of being able to create life without soul. Francine didn't have one. And the story goes that he made this little automata of the girl that, of his servant that, she was obviously charming. She died of scarlet fever. And he really loved her, as a child. And so he had a model of her, an automata for her in his trunk, and the captain of a ship when they were on a sea voyage found her.
Wow.
And the crew was so freaked out about this, This is black magic to these guys.
Yeah.
It's one step away from a homunculus.
So he takes it out and throws it overboard.
It's the original story of Pinocchio, except Pinocchio was magically enchanted, I guess. I don't know how else to put it.
Mm-hmm. These are archetypical stories that keep reoccurring.
And what the story that really stood out to me as well, I'm going to look up here. I sent a message to a friend of mine, shout out to Slick Dissident Gabriel, because it really blew my mind, where the Daidala, because you get into the idea of these buildings being machines. They're actual machines, and they're programmed for a certain function, and they become
passive thinking machines.
Passive. The Daidala.
So Daidala comes from Daidala, is Daidala, and what stood out to me was this idea of enchanting this Daidala. So jewels, or with charisma, and making it a talisman. And the quote that you put in, that it's Alberto Perez Gomez when he writes about the labyrinth and Daidalas. Daidala or art objects can appear to be what they are not, and the metal plates give a value to the objects that they would not otherwise have. The principal value of Daidala is that of enabling the inanimate matter to become magically alive, of reproducing life rather than representing it. Hence, the word also designates automata, marvelous animated machines with the brilliant suits of armor and scintillating eyes. And that made me think of Transformers. It's a Transformer.
Well, exactly. It's funny that you're talking about it, because Perez Gomez is writing about Daedalus, the prototypical Greek architect in mythology, creates the myth, the labyrinth, control the Minotaur. He is supposed to design the divider. He was said to have been able to make statues so lifelike they had to chain them down at night so they wouldn't walk away, which is fascinating. But it's the exact same game as the automata, the Transformers you're talking about. AI is about that, and you endlessly get the same sort of theme in robot movies, etc. And these are just one, again, what Frankenstein's story, the story of Frankenstein is all about. This, it's the fact that can human makes reproduce ourselves, but do we really have the ability to create a soul within that human? And the soul is what deals with the spiritual and the magical.
It's a good question. Whether or not we can is, I think, a matter of time. Inevitably, I think it is one of the big goals of some areas of science, and undoubtedly, I think it's inevitable at some point to be able to maybe contort information and funnel it into such a thing. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I see so much of this, you can lift a rock and find millions of life forms there underneath. And, what consciousness is seems to maybe be connected to magnetism and, the planets, and I don't know. I know nothing of the sort. It's also deep and speculative, really. Even science, it's at points, and the heavy neuroscience, is some speculations at some point about consciousness, because we really just don't know, but we sure would love to inoculate a homunculus with consciousness.
The Arnaldian homunculus. There was this guy that I think Tostalo talks about, the 15th century theologian, and he talks about how he would alchemically make a homunculus, so this little magical man, and right as it was being born, right as it was coming alive, the Arnaldo de Villa, I forget his name, I think that's it, he would smash it and kill it, because he's like, wait, God died for everybody's sins, but I don't know if he died for that homunculus's sin, because I just made that. I made that, me. So is God gonna die for, did he die for that sin of that thing? So he would kill it before it would have a soul, quote unquote, before it would be possessed by a soul. And this is one of the first concepts, even before Paracelsus talked about the homunculus in the 16th century. The Arnaldian homunculus was one of the first ones, one of the first stories. So he would make it, and as soon as he made it, he would smash it, because he was afraid of what it, the ethical questions of it. What did I just make another soul? Does it have a soul? Will it be possessed by a soul afterwards? It's a very interesting concept.
Well, this is always a position, and the architects and the designers and the artists, who are many times, particularly during the Renaissance, were the same. They were always playing in this area, and they used to call them the divino artista, the divine artist, because they were really dealing with that sort of issue.
Have you heard of Kobo Daishi?
Yeah.
There's a story how you're talking about Daidala, where he would make these automata, these creations, and they would run out of the lab. Well, Kobo Daishi, there's a story revolving around him where he was carving out these dragons that were outside this temple, and they were carved out so lifelike, and he was painting them almost so lifelike that when he put the last drop of paint on it, it was so well done that the dragons came to life, right? The dragons came to life, and he freaked out because, like, this is perfection. I can't have this happen. So he takes another color and he throws it on there, and the dragon goes back to just being a wooden dragon, a sculpture.
Yeah, well, that's that humans are not perfect has been a recurring theme. You find when you're making a carpet, they'll put a flaw in there to say, this is human. Or if you're making a beautiful Japanese pot, they'll put a little mistake in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For those reasons.
And this idea of, you mentioned temples earlier, where I was born and raised Pentecostal Christian, so I'm used to seeing people run around and do all this funny stuff and speak in tongues and go crazy at church, at a temple, right? We're with the congregation. And
where were you raised?
Where was I raised?
Yeah.
I was born in Puerto Rico, raised in Florida.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I taught in Texas. There are a lot of Pentecostals. So
yeah. Well,
projects like this, and they, you end up talking to them.
Yeah, they speak in tongues, and they just take everything super literal. So the idea of conducting ritual at a temple, where the temple becomes this place for the gods to inhabit. I believe you talked about in your book where the domes, they would have pictures of the angels, because what they believed that these entities were swirling around in there. They believed that they encapsulated these entities within there, these angels. You wrote about that in your book, right?
No, but it's true. The domes were really representation of the heavens. That came from the Roman, where you would look, the dome would represent the sort of the society, the Roman society that covered the world. So you look at Parthenon, and that's Roman society presented. So the Christians picked this up. In fact, everybody's trading this stuff back and forth. So if you're looking at the Greek philosophy, it's all from the Mediterranean, a lot from Egypt. Egypt sort of develops its own, but the hieroglyphics are, is sort of the Mediterranean culture from the all over the Mediterranean, um, and they all just sort of borrowed and modeled from each other.
And you know what? I haven't actually ever looked up. What did the houses of the Egyptians look like? Did they live in like huts or something, or did they build crazy the homes that they actually lived in, or were they live in the
They
temples?
build typically one. Actually, if you're going to Egypt, and there is the village for all the workers that were working on the pyramids. When they would come, when the Nile would go up, and they couldn't farm, so they all had to go someplace, and they'd work on the pyramids and make money. And I think that Pharaoh probably realized this. Probably his advisors told him that idle hands are the devil's workshop, and so keep them busy and pay them something so they can eat, and tax them so they can pay for it all. And there's a village you can see down below, just the foundations of the whole village of all the workers, and they're sort of one room buildings that people lived in.
Interesting. And yeah, I've heard
Can,
that they've come up with the golden ratio because of that, because the the Nile would flood, and then when it would recede, people didn't know where their land started and ended, so they came up with this ratio so it could be like, hey, this is your grid, and this is your grid, and et cetera, et cetera. That's a story that I heard one time.
Architecture always, and part of architecture is it's really trying to control and understand nature. So they would look around at nature and look at the proportion of things, and found the golden section was everywhere. If you look at Corinthian columns, they have the spiral at the top. Those are from how acacia leaves grew, and they represented the golden section. The proportions of temples are always sort of in the golden section.
Beautiful.
Fascinating.
Can I ask you a question? I have to leave in 15 minutes to go do something. Unfortunately, I feel like we could probably talk for hours upon hours. But something before we go. He's like, maybe. Labyrinths. What is your opinion on the function of labyrinths as opposed to strictly aesthetic and the spiritual function and potentially magical function of labyrinths?
Well, labyrinths are symbolic of human search for order. That people have used it in novels. For example, Name of the Rose, as the library was drawn up as a labyrinth. Actually, when Umberto Eco was teaching over at the University of Toronto, just a couple blocks from where I'm teaching, he used the model of the Robarth Library, how you sort of go in there and learn and understand the world.
Cool.
I've actually been to the palace at Minos, and it's big. I kind of got lost in it. Trying to find your way.
Did you find the Minotaur?
No, I found the tour group, and so I found my way back. But it's very interesting when you start to think about what it means. The labyrinth is containing the Minotaur. The Minotaur is a gift from the gods. It was given through a union of the queen, who fell in love with this big bull. And, the architect created this sort of fake bull she could get into, and so they could mate. And she gave birth to the Minotaur, which was half god, half gift of God, half human. So they wanted to create a place to control it. So, in other words, they're creating order and trying to create a way to control this message of the gods,
And
which is really a form of nature.
Would you say the Minotaur is representative of, well, like a bestial nature of man or something like that, trying to handle that?
I would argue that it's probably a gift of the gods.
So like a Promethean fire?
In a way.
Really? A gift from the gods? That's an interesting gift to give somebody. A half man, half bull god.
Yeah,
I'll
I
take
mean,
one.
you're these poor guys. All of a sudden, this appears. Nobody understood what the hell it meant. So let's try and create something that can put some order around it. By the way, you find labyrinths everywhere. In
Yeah,
fact, uh,
everywhere.
uh, they're in cathedrals, and they represent the pilgrim's journey. So you find them in many cathedrals.
Yeah, I remember
And
Roman
they're
telling me about that.
really, oh yeah, no, they're absolutely everywhere. And that's why I was wondering, your interpretation of the symbolism is because they are so vast and widespread. Solomon said to be having of the labyrinth as well, and his magical workings and those keys of Solomon and such. And it usually location wise of a labyrinth, from my experience, is in a very specific location. And I think
Usually, as you just enter the cathedral.
yeah. And, cathedrals are built on sacred sites, generally associated with ley lines or electromagnetic hotspots of sorts. Um, and I like to dive into Sufism. Sufism is very fascinating to me. I think they associate some of the movement amongst the Sufis with the labyrinth walking and like just kind of keeping that motion going, that sort of circular motion that might be iterated in the movement of the building and the body at the same time to kind of
Mm.
keep a flow going and keep a spiritual funnel open, because humans, we are meant to move around, in my opinion. We need to move, we need to just like reach and go and grab for in order to bring down and harness spiritual energy and bring it into our essence. And
Oh, you bring up an absolute, yeah. In fact, you brought up a point that I missed on the labyrinth. That Paris Gomez makes the argument, and I think it's correct, that they also represent dance step. And the step of the dance is like a ritual. There used to be almost magical rituals. If you did this dance, something would happen. You did that dance. Maybe it would rain, or maybe you would find your lover, or whatever. Um, so if you think about it, he would make the argument that it's a dance step in stone.
oh, beautiful. We got to
Well, it's
relearn that
also like
dance.
architecture's frozen music. It's the same game.
Oh, beautiful. There we
Wow.
go.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Well,
really
think about it.
fascinating.
There's rhythm and order and you know emotion.
Shape is rhythm, right? Shape is rhythm. It's a, like you say, like it's like music in stone. It's, yeah, it's like a form of rhythm, that shape to bend a curve. Oh wow, yeah. It's I feel okay. I want to ask one more about the importance of embellishing resonance through basilicas, and the magic of sound being incorporated into architecture, the resonance
Acoustics.
and reverberation, the acoustics, acoustio archaeoacoustics.
I mean, these guys are masters of this, but they realize that humans have more senses than just sight. So you go into the place, not only it's the sound, but you go into and you go, if when you travel through Europe, you'll remember this, or you go into your first cathedral if you haven't. There's a certain smell of 1,000 years of unwashed pilgrims and incense desperately trying to cover it up. It smells a certain way, and it's memorable, one of the most memorable places. Or walking down cobblestone streets, the texture. These are all the ways the
Yeah.
human body remembers. So
Oof.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, and these guys were not. I mean, if you look at the architects, they were geniuses because
Mhm.
they bring you in and they pull your eye up into that stained glass window and the light to the heavens, and you just go, "Oh my goodness!"
How crazy is that?
That is just, it reminds me of um being heightened within the, gosh, that is so beautiful, the blue. Oh,
Impressive,
good.
huh? And it makes you think about greater things.
Yes, it
Wow.
does. Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think about time itself. It really does. Like it almost encapsulates that Saturnian type of like father time, Chronos captured in time. Like it looks like you'd be able to go in here and hit a switch and literally walk out
It's
into
fucking
another
Hogwarts,
time.
bro. You're in some
Yes.
magical shit.
Albert, it has been a true pleasure. I have to go run. And Juan, thank you for letting me come on and join this chat, brother. I appreciate you both.
Yeah, for sure,
By
bro.
the way, where are you guys located? I'm sorry, I didn't know that. Where you are?
I'm in California.
And I'm in Florida.
Oh, we're in Florida, my friend.
Central Florida, so Orlando.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of
I lived in the Panhandle at one time.
over by Tallahassee, Tallahassee or Pensacola,
Fort Walton Beach.
Fort Walton. Nice,
My father was in the military.
nice. And did you have? You said you had some points as well. I don't know if you wanted to wrap up on those. We can continue the conversation on the points that you had, because again, this book is one of the things that stood out to me here is the idea of architects passing on traditions and passing on information and portfolios compared to grimoires, a book of spells. You get into that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the these are almost secret documents, like the book of Villard de Honeycutt, which were how to build arches and etc. They'd actually go from town to town with models under their arms and the flying buttresses. They were creating sort of almost magical things with the technology. Any new technology, as you probably know, is many times considered almost magical by the population.
Yeah, proportions, and that's why the whole Pythagorean Palace thing really piqued my interest, because the Pythagoreans, they literally worshipped the number. They didn't just see it as a quantitative thing. It was a qualitative, where each number it was its own archetype essentially. And
yeah, and that's not only with the Renaissance, but that happened all over. I've just written with a friend an article. She wrote an article, appeared in a Chinese journal on magic numbers measuring to create a town. The Luban towns in China. And,
magic number to create a town, you
yeah,
said?
they had rulers, and each number had a magical meaning. And so if you use this number and that number to create, beams, etc., it had certain meanings and create certain events. They believe.
Interesting. So again,
Still
back
do.
to,
I mean, try selling a house with a lot of fours in the number to.
is that bad? I haven't never tried.
Is eights are lucky.
So even in the address itself, people take that
Yeah.
into really.
And they still do it. I mean, come on, don't you get a little nervous by buying a house number 13 or living on the 13th floor?
Or 666, or people. I had a credit card with
Yeah,
666.
666. Yeah,
Yeah,
you're going to hell.
that would make sense. For as non-superstitious as we want to be, sometimes we are pretty superstitious when it comes to things like that, where you're saying the number 7 or number 8 or number 4. Yeah, I didn't think about that, where again, I'm not
Magic numbers. Yeah, there was a big issue. Exactly as you're talking about. Geometry was considered almost magical.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just in the Renaissance, though they brought it back. The Renaissance at that point, then the architects had to make the decisions. Before, the church would sort of tell the architects, you'll do it this way, you'll do it that way, because, this is the way cathedrals are built. So the Renaissance comes along and the architects are given a little bit more freedom, and you start to see some really amazing geometrical studies.
Do you know where the church was getting their stuff from? Did they have their own architects that were I forgot the name of the one that had the religion really embedded into his work. I have to find it.
Alberti was a priest, for example,
Was it
and an architect.
I don't think it was Alberti. I took note of it somewhere. It was the one where here, I'll find it. But were they would just hijack the design and make it all religious instead of having.
Yeah, well, and think about a cathedral. It's pretty much three, based on threes for the Holy Trinity and disproportion representing that. And they kind of go, yeah, why are you trying to do this differently?
Mhm.
So they burn them at the stake.
I think it might have been was it Gaudi? I'm trying to find here.
Oh, Gaudi's a very interesting guy. Antonio Gaudi, Spanish architect who died at the beginning of the last century. Do you realize he's up for sainthood?
Really? This architect? Yeah, so it is Gaudi.
Yeah. Francis is big on pushing him, and he's because he's gone through the process fairly well because they thought that the building had actually created miracles by converting people. And stories are true, of course.
Seriously?
I suspect you're Catholic like I am. So the church goes through a very rigorous process, for sainthood. And he's going through and moving through fairly rapidly through the process.
Interesting. I think, did we lose you, Dr. Smith?
Yeah.
You froze up there for a second. You said, and he's moving up fairly quickly through the ranks.
In the process towards sainthood.
Really? That's really interesting because it goes back to what you were talking about at the beginning of the book, where these architects, they achieve positions of power they would become pharaohs because they were seen as, they're talking about what role. So they're talking about this building helping manifest miracles. And which building in particular is it?
Sagrada Familia. Sagrada Familia is the cathedral in the middle of Barcelona. Actually, it's almost the symbol of the city.
How do you spell it? Can you say it a little bit slower?
S-A-G, Sagrada
Familia?
Sagrada Familia.
Here we go. Oh, wow. That is crazy looking. It looks like something
it isn't, but if you start to analyze it, it's quite a conservative building. This guy was highly religious. So he's really taking his dogma from the Catholic Church and using natural forms. So he uses seashells and the way they twist up. He builds this whole thing through models. I've studied this thing and gone there and studied the models to create natural forms. Much of this is from nature.
This is really beautiful.
He didn't actually use drawings. He built architectural models to design it. And so they never quite finished it after he got hit by a streetcar out front, died. So they hadn't finished it. And the Spanish Civil War came along and they took all the old models out and tossed them in the trench around the building. And they used it for stables, I think it was. But they wanted to go back and build the church. They didn't know how to do it. They had to go dig up the trench around the church to find the old models. And they're desperately sitting there gluing them together when I was there.
Really?
What he was intending to do.
This is amazing. Do you know how long it took him to build this?
This actually started in the late 1800s, and they haven't finished.
So
they're still finishing it now.
Wow. Yeah. So he was very, because he talks about the tetrahedron and how it represents the Trinity and the lines and the Holy Ghost and all. That's how you're saying the three.
It's very similar to straightforward cathedral. He's following dogma. He's just taking it a little farther, almost like the late Renaissance.
It is 560 feet tall.
It's a big building. thousands of people can go in there. It's the main basilica for the city itself.
Wow, it's really beautiful. So
But
you've
they
been
say
there?
that, oh yeah, I've studied there. I've been down to the museum. I talked to all the historians. I was there for the International Year of Gaudi.
So we see here the design. It goes back to that cross, the
Yeah, it's your
Vitruvian man.
standard church design.
Very,
But
very cool.
Barcelona's on the ocean, so he's using seashells, he's
Hmm.
using nautical, but it also has a huge Moorish aspect, and so he takes pieces from the Moorish design.
Hmm. My question to you was, so we have this idea that this building helps make miracles, right? And have miracles happen. Where does where do ley lines and longitude and latitude play a role when an architect is going to build something of this significance? I mean, something this massive, something that's going to be used by the church. Did they have a way of calculating that at all?
He's just a really great architect, so it becomes very sophisticated. He's looking at some very sophisticated work to be able to do that. Can you imagine the minds that went in here? Well, the reason he was able to do it is he was educated as an engineer. He knew mechanics, and so when he was making his machine, he knew how it could go together, and he would study it and develop it through architectural models.
And can we talk a little bit about the exact role that models play? Because when we first spoke on the phone the first time, you were going on about the models and how important they were in the process of
Form of
architecture.
representation, and probably the most direct because it's the easiest for both architects and the clients to understand because it's the most one-to-one.
Mm.
The word model comes from modus, from the Latin modus, which literally means to measure. And what they were doing is trying to measure, the world and create a space that explained and could help to control nature in the ways that we talked about earlier, about, keeping the ghosts away and the rain off your head. So he would study these. He would look at, he'd put hanging chains down to take a look at the geometric form of parabola and hyperbolic curves. Very sophisticated stuff because he understood the models, and then start to use those within his designs. Build them out of plaster and test it. And in fact, he lived down in the basement of Sagrada Familia as going up like a monk. He gave up everything and just built the cathedral because he's a very spiritual guy. That helps when you're trying to be a saint. They don't find all this bad stuff about you. So he lived in the basement, and he surrounds himself with his architectural models instead of religious icons because he, I think, really realized they were the same. They were representing and trying to explain God's work.
So he was surrounding himself with his models that were these are the ones that are huge, right? The huge models where it's almost lifelike. And
Well, they were, I mean, he built those, but he also built hundreds of little small ones. I mean, a building like this, you do a lot.
I can't even begin to comprehend how you would start start something like this, because I mean, just looking
Yeah.
at it is intimidating. So
The truth is, you start with a big idea. What's my concept? And his was like glorifying God. And he's glorifying God through geometry and proportion and his nature. And he's using all that in the building.
I have here Gaudi, with his theurgical approach, used geometry to create a clear framework on which to base his understanding of immeasurable things. So, how you're saying to encapsulate God and to reflect a more divine world, but this idea that he would sit around with his models, and you said that they would replace the saints, the little figurines of the saints. So he would have, instead of that, he would have building models around him.
Well, he did have the little building models around there. I'm This is my interpretation.
Okay, I thought it was an actual thing, but the idea
Well, he was down there like that.
is really beautiful if you really think
Yeah.
about it. Where it's like,
Well,
these are my
exactly.
friends, and this is a representation of God. These models, so therefore, I have, I guess, deity around at the same time as being while being at a church. That's
Well, you find this in a mosque where it's geometry presenting
mm-hmm,
the idea of God.
mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Christians did it too, but they also used icons of
Yes.
human. And that's a way to try and measure the unmeasurable through the human body.
You talk about the disconnection, the loss of enchantment when it comes to building, and we talked a little bit about it at the beginning. And then you talk about re-enchantment. Do you?
Let me talk about that. Can you? I'd like to read something here really
Yeah,
quickly.
go ahead.
We can talk about it. Architecture emerges from and is inherently integrated in society's belief and search for understanding. We've talked about that. And in this search, principles related to magic have played a significant role. Magic from early history has been essential in the process of architecture, as most technology. If magic is an attempt to control nature and engage the divine, then the objects such as the architecture itself that has been acted upon is enchanted. So the concept of enchantment is the state of being under a spell, magic, with a great delight or charm, and can clarify how architects can be a form of magician. I would like to propose that many of the architects have lasting reputations, have continued engaging concepts related to magic in their designs. Consequently, if the principles of re-enchantment remain relevant to architecture, and I think it does, and that's why I'm excited by this podcast and what you're doing, which is, I think, hitting a pretty important trend early. Then it is critical to remind contemporary architects how they may use concepts of magic in order to enchant their buildings. The exclusion of magical practices, a type of disenchantment, getting rid of it, was conceived by the rational movement of the scientific or industrial revolution, which you probably know about, that has fallen a little bit into repute. It was a prevalent belief, and most philosophers of the 19th century pretty well adhered to this theory. However, even if one accepts this school of thought, it remains important to remember that magic, to various degrees, historically has been important to our understanding of the world. And to rectify a seemingly disenchanted world, the philosopher Joseph Lundy, these guys are really interesting, and Michael Saylor, in his book, The Re-enchantment of the World, proposes notions that may re-enchant a contemporary society. So I think these guys are doing some pretty interesting work. They give out 10 concepts that appear to derive from historical sources reflecting literature related to magic. So Lundy and Saylor describes how contemporary society can promote re-enchantment, and writes that as the world is to be enchanted, it must have mystery, wonder, order, purpose, significance attached to objects and events encountered. It must be susceptible to redemption, have intellectual locus for the infinite, and in re-enchantment, there must be a way of carving out within the profane world a set of spaces that possesses the allure of the sacred, display miracles that can be viewed as exceptional events that go against the accepted order of things, or exhibit secular epiphanies, which create unity with something larger than themselves. I believe these qualities of re-enchantment can be used to clarify the significant relationships between magic and contemporary architecture. Now, that is not to say that many of the great architects of the past haven't realized that and have done this. They do, and you can start to analyze their work and see it all over the place. But I think too many have sort of cut it out of their building. This is just a building to make money, et cetera. And you get soulless places. There's a famous housing development that was put up outside St. Louis called Pruitt-Igoe. It was built on just pure scientific principles, and it went up, and they really didn't realize that they needed these sort of issues to give it a soul. And the population revolted and kind of burned the place down. And finally, they just had to tear the whole place down because it became a soulless, crime-ridden trash heap. And it sort of sits as some people use it as sort of the end of the modern movement, where they really cut out all the sort of the spiritual. Now I think there's a strong movement through phenomenology, et cetera, going back to the spiritual to try and reinvest architecture with many of these issues. So those are some of the issues I think that are important to sort of put into it. And that's why when I look at Gaudi's work, or I look at, even going back to Corbu, et cetera, these are things that make it great architecture, because they deal with the entire human spirit, how we inhabit the world, and understand it, define it.
Make architecture great again. Where but here's the thing.
It wasn't bad. I mean, all the great modernists kind of understood this. Guys like, you ever see Catlin's Tower?
No, I'll pull it up now though. Catlin's Tower?
Catlin, Tatlin.
Oh yeah, it's in your book. I saw this in your book. Let me pull it up here on the screen. It was in the section with Gaudi, I believe. So here it is.
Yeah,
Right
this guy, there's Talon down at the bottom. He creates this huge model, and this is to be the headquarters for the Third International, the Communist Party that's in Russia, as it developed in 1919. So he builds this huge model. It's supposed to be 1,500 feet tall when they built the thing, and it had these rooms in the side that were turning around. But this thing is so loaded with alchemy and mythology and magic. Why? Because they couldn't use imagery from the church anymore. So he knew the Russians are pretty spiritual people, and if you took it all out, you got a problem. And so when you start to analyze this thing, you start to find all those wonderful issues from alchemy. And you can go back to this squaring of the circle of the alchemists. There's a beautiful etching of the squaring of the circle.
That's what Pythagoras means, the one who squares the circle.
Yeah, pull up, let's see, I don't know if I have that here, but his buddy, he had a buddy named, an artist called L. Liszewski, and he copies the alchemist squaring the circle, and he has Catlin designing the tower, and it's full of, alchemical, mythological symbolism.
So he copied this design. Do you have the name of that building? The model?
This building?
The one that got copied, his friend?
Oh, go to Alchemist Squaring the Circle. Alchemist Squaring of the Circle. It should come up. Okay, see the guy the kind of yellow one on the top row, him, right?
Yeah, this one.
Yeah. If you look down at the building, it's the plan is basically that.
Really?
Yeah.
What the heck?
Yeah, it's amazing. Now go El Liziski,
How do you spell it?
E-L, and then Liziski, the next word. This is a famous artist from the period.
There you go.
L-I-Z-Z. Yeah. And go Tatlin.
So the same thing?
Yeah, Tatlin. Now, Tatlin was his buddy. And you see this first row of images, those are collages he made.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you put that image of the squaring of the circle and images, he's just copying that. But instead of down at the bottom of the Alchemist, which he has at his feet the cross, Liziski has the geometry and mathematical formulas. And, he's got the lever. He's trying to lever the world into Marxism. The thing points at the North Star, sort of the Communist Party.
Wow.
He used to have a kid sit inside and turn the crank so this whole thing would turn around and take it out to parades to explain. And the whole building becomes sort of a demonstration of where the Marxist Party was going. People would, all the walls were projectors. It's just an extraordinary building. You can analyze it on and on and on.
And it's got a resemblance to the Tower of Babel, too, if you look at it. All these depictions of the Tower of Babel.
Well, what it is the caduceus, the double helix spiral of the snakes of Hermes. You need to know about Hermes.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Yes.
Go put up Hermes. I love the Tower of Babel. That's a
Hermes, the messenger god.
Yeah.
The caduceus.
See the caduceus? There he is. He's bringing the message from the gods.
Mm-hmm.
From the gods. I mean, to the communists? My God, they must have hated that. But, they got it.
And it would make sense because he's the one that can transcend the different layers of reality without being,
Yeah, he's the god that could go from the heavens to the earth, bring messages.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think we're on a right path when it comes to, because we have teachers like you that are writing about these sort of things and you're talking to your students about it and you're re-enchanting, I guess, the minds of these young architects right now that are going to be the future. And that's kind of what Romie was talking about at the beginning, where we want to be at the forefront of this alchemical revival of whatever reality is and trying to study that and come up with our own interpretations of things. But I think it's great that you're talking about this sort of thing. You're writing about it from a scholarly point of view, and it's being taken seriously. It's being taken as, again, academically, not just me, a random guy with a podcast trying to talk about it. This is why I have people like you who are experts in the field to talk about things like this, because you have experience, you have actual experience, and you know the history. Do you feel that there is a revamping up of this re-enchantment as we move on? Because from what I'm seeing here,
yeah, I think people are really interested. The problem is if you cut out all the enchantment, architecture has a tendency to start to become political and just sort of meaningless. It becomes about money.
Well, that's what here in Florida, they're building hundreds and hundreds of houses and buildings, and how you said they're just empty shells that they're just cookie cutter communities. That's what it is. And I live in a cookie cutter house, but I mean, that's all.
It's meaningless.
Yeah, exactly. And you were talking about how science, so after the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and the step away from alchemy into chemistry and leaving, you had that dogma of back then, if it was mathematical in nature or scientific in nature, it was black magic automatically, because only the higher ups could have this sort of knowledge or whatever it was. But it comes back to the AI argument where people say, when you approach the singularity, that technology is going to take over everything. And the idea of making everything more cost effective and more technologically advanced. And you gave the example of this place that was just done according to science, and it went to shit and everybody burned everything down. That's the role of science, pure science, zero soul, into architecture, into the material. Without that, again, back to the soul, there's no soul into it. It's just reproduction, money, 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 money at the end of the day. And what's the best cost-effective alternative? And they're just putting up shoe boxes and what looks like houses made out of toothpicks that have nothing in them to show. You know what I mean? It's just an empty, hollow shell, how you're saying. And it goes back to science taking over and just making everything soulless in a way.
If you look at the word architect, it means prime technologist. We have that prime responsibility for all of these things. And architects have traditionally gotten involved in, just about the design of everything, from furniture to, I've known architects do cruise ships, etc. Renzo Piano did one a few years ago. So, and they're can be quite interesting. So this certainly is a part of their responsibility.
And as we approach the end here, Dr. Smith, did you want to add any final thoughts, any final ideas? Did you have any other ideas that you wanted to bring up? Any more talking points that you wanted to touch on before we head on out of here?
No, I think I've said what I want to, but if you've got any more questions.
I think, where do you see the future of architecture as far as, I'm really interested in the re-enchantment of things. Do you think it's going to go there? Do you think it's going to...
I think it's going to go there. You could see it everywhere. There are people writing about the spiritual. There are people talking about phenomenological issues, which are, greater things. They all understand that this is a bit of a problem, and if they don't start to engage it. Representation's been there for a while. But I certainly think there's going to be quite a bit more of that as it comes along, as we sort of tie in to... I think there's going to be more of a tying into the university as a whole for architecture. It's not going to be so isolated in a little silo, but it will be more about, the sort of a broader sense of how humans should inhabit the world.
Very nice. And Dr. Smith, I want to thank you for coming on today and talking to myself and to Romie, who had to go. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I enjoyed the book. For those that want to, you can find it online, The Architect as Magician by Dr. Albert C. Smith, and I will post a link to where you can find the book in the description of the episode. And thank you again, Dr. Smith, for coming on here.
You can get it on Amazon.
Oh, you can find it on Amazon? I didn't know.
Oh, yeah.
Awesome. You can find it on Amazon, and I'll post the links to that. Did you want to plug anything else, Dr. Smith? Do you have any social media?
Well, if you're interested in models, my book, Architectural Modelist Machine, is also on there. I have a bunch of books on design process, if you're interested in that sort of thing. Or
yeah.
The character of the architect, how architects think, which I think.
I'm going to be reading the model as machine one. I have to pick up a copy of that because I wasn't able to read it in time, but I'll have you back on once I read that as well. And again, thank you, Dr. Smith, for coming on. Had a lot of fun. And hopefully you enjoyed your first podcast ever. I think this was
Thanks for making it easy. You made the conversation go along. You didn't just stare at me and say, speak.
I'm trying to keep up with you in the conversation because I'm not an architect, so I'm trying to pull my notes together and come up with it.
I didn't tell you my parents met in Puerto Rico.
Oh, really? What part? Do you know?
Juan.
Oh, San Juan?
San Juan. Yeah.
I think you told me the first time we talked on the phone, actually.
My father was in the Army. My grandfather was in the Army they were stationed out of Puerto Rico.
Awesome. Shout out to Puerto Rico. Well,